Are you looking to DIY this dual-zoned IKEA motion sensor-driven LED handrail, and all for around a third the cost? And best of all, with no app or programming required? So after refinishing out the walls of this musty old shiplap stairwell, it was time to replace the handrail. And since the young people in the house can never seem to manage to turn off this hallway light switch, I wanted to get some sort of motion sensor activated light source with built-in timeout running down this hallway, so I wouldn't be constantly opening this door to shut off the overhead light every night. And ideally, I wanted to accomplish this whole thing without any programming or overly complicated app. So for today's video, we're going to walk you through exactly what I paid for each of these IKEA components, as well as the specific setup I used to create this whole system, and all for nearly 2/3 less than what I would have paid had I done this the way IKEA recommends. But before we get to the details, if you enjoy this type of money-saving DIY content, please take a minute to hit that like button and even consider subscribing, but not if you have a money allergy. I know there are probably a few people out there allergic to money who absolutely hate this channel. So if your seasonal money allergies are beginning to flare up and you couldn't bear the idea of saving a few dollars, do not, I repeat, do not hit that subscribe. Alright, so as you probably noticed in the shots from the intro, this stairwell has a bit of a bend at the top, which, given the way they've framed out the drywall, prevents a single centrally placed sensor from quickly detecting motion at both entry points. Basically, there wasn't a spot where it could see around the corner there, without simultaneously being obstructed by the low ceiling near the foot of the stairs. So after realizing that I would indeed need a two-sensor setup, my idea was to take this IKEA KABBLEKA LED strip, plug it into a GRILLPLATS Matter smart plug, and then pair that smart plug to a couple MYGGSPRAY sensors. But what I found out after speaking with an IKEA smart home associate was that if you're going to link up multiple devices to a single smart plug, you will also need to purchase the DIRIGERA hub, which is going to cost you an additional $109, more than 4xing your total material costs.
You serious?
So after a bit more brainstorming, I came to realize that I could actually save nearly 2/3 of that if I just made one simple adjustment. So instead of trying to pair both sensors to a single smart plug, into which we'd plug in our strip of LEDs, I decided to pair each sensor to its own plug, and then dedicate an individual strip of lights into each plug as well. I'd then just run both the LED strips down the underside of the handrail, and with everything now running 1:1:1, we'd no longer need to purchase the hub, as we'd no longer be trying to pair multiple sensors to the same plug. So there you have it, dual motion sensor setup. No app, programming, or DIRIGERA hub required, and best of all, if you side-by-side the two project costs, you can see that we're still way under what we would have paid had we went the IKEA recommended route.
Nice.
So now that we've went over our project savings, let's run through the actual setup, because there's a few tips and tricks that I've stumbled upon along the way that I wish I would have known before starting this project.
Okay.
But before we can integrate the IKEA components and save that money, we first need to fashion ourselves a handrail. And what we have here is a rig that I put together onto which I could fasten our rail throughout the staining process. You can see I put in this notch, so both sides will sit nicely on the plow that's been cut into the bottom of the rail. I'm also sinking a couple wood screws into that same hollowed-out channel to really hold it on there. This rail, by the way, is an unfinished 10-foot-long piece of plowed red oak from Home Depot that I'll link in the description. Now, before we sand the whole thing with our orbital, we're going to just wipe it down with a damp cloth and then let it dry about 20 minutes or so to raise the grain. This process definitely accentuates the feel of those places that might need a bit more attention with the sander. Speaking of which, that red disc that I've got on there is a 150 grit, and then I'll follow it up with another pass of this 220 before wiping it all down with a tack cloth and putting on the first coat of our stain. I'll speed this up, but just make sure to wear a mask and use a shop vac adapter like this one that I'll link in the description. Aside from that, just try and lightly hover your orbital on the rail so that you take care not to gouge anything. Okay, so with our sanding done, and after a quick wipe down of the dust, it's time to apply some of this stain. Now make sure you wear a pair of rubber gloves, and when you open this up, you'll want to stir the can instead of shaking it. I like to just go ahead and dip some old t-shirts right into the can, and then while leading with a wet edge and working a little at a time, try to really get some on there. Now when it comes time to dispose of the rags, just make sure to not leave them balled up somewhere when you're done, as they can actually self-ignite and become combustible while drying. So I'd say, just to be safe, Hang them out on a clothesline or lay them flat somewhere until they're totally dry and stiff. Alright, so after 5 minutes or so, you'll want to take a rag and wipe off the excess stain, as it'll get darker the longer you leave it on there. Once you're happy with the color, let things dry overnight, and then it's time to brush on your polyurethane. I last used this can 3 to 4 years ago, so it required quite a bit of stirring to mix it back to its former self. So overall, before it dries clear, this water-based product always goes on a bit milkier than you'd like. But despite the milkiness, make sure that you're still leading with a wet edge and very lightly covering all your brush strokes. From there, just don't leave any bubbles in your finish, and try and get everything done in 5 minutes or so. Now, when you get to the end of the rail, make sure you're still brushing with the grain and off the far edge, as you don't want things to dry with a lip on there. And with this first application looking pretty decent, it's time to let this set up a few hours, before putting on another coat later this evening. Okay, so here we are after letting that dry throughout the afternoon, and since this is a handrail and we want a fairly glossy surface, I'm actually going to give it another super light sanding to knock down any dust nibs with this 400 grit emery paper, and then dust it off and hit it with another application of the polyurethane. 2 to 3 coats of this stuff is where I find the sweet spot to be, depending on how much of a grain type feel you want on there. Keep in mind it's better to apply multiple thin coats, and I've found you really have to baby the shoulders there, making sure you get enough on those corners, but not so much as to leave any kind of milky residue. Alright, so I actually ended up throwing a third coat on there, and while I wait a few days for that to dry, I'll go ahead and mark out the hardware placements on the wall. So code in my area requires that we mount this somewhere between 34 and 38 inches from the front edge of the stair nose on the top and bottom steps. So what I've done here is put a 35-inch line on that measuring stick there, and am using this as a guide to lightly mark the top and bottom of our handrail. From there, we can grab a couple of these thumbtacks and place them in the wall at those 2 spots, and then tie off a line of string between the 2 points to represent our top line. With our top line now visible, we can begin to approximate where the rail will intersect each of our 5 studs. Just keep an eye out for any sag you might have in your line before actually placing the hardware and drilling. As you can probably tell, I ended up having to tighten mine up a bit and then readjust these marks. Okay, so fast forward another few days, and we are finally ready to start mounting both the LEDs as well as the handrail. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I'll be running a couple of these strips along the underside of the rail, and in order to create our completely cordless presentation, I'm going to be slipping them through one of these hardware pieces, which are conveniently fabricated with this hollow arm on them. To help you better visualize what I'm talking about, here's a look at the underside of the rail from a little further on in the build. You can see how the lead wires sort of run up into that piece of hardware, and then disappear into the wall. So getting that in there actually involved running each of the 10-foot LED strips through the hardware backwards, if you will. I had originally planned to just pass the shorter lead wire ends of the strips through, but as I quickly found out, that connector piece there was not making it through the right angle. And despite looking like the measurements would work online before I bought everything, it was still an extremely tight fit to get them through there. So if you end up buying the exact same hardware and LEDs as I'm using here, I'd recommend you remount the inside of that zinc alloy 45-degree angle a bit so that you don't damage your light strips pulling them through. While mine did come through without any reaming, it definitely didn't feel great having to yank them through there like that. Now, since we only have 5 stud placements to choose from on our wall here, we can do a real loose dry fitting of our lead wire, just to make sure that we'll have enough run to get from the bottom of our rail to the point at which things will pass through the wall. But before we go on, I want to explain both how and why I place these LED strips onto the underside of the rail, and also take a look at what I use to secure them in place. So I've got both strips pushed just as far as I can to the side of the plow there, which is accomplishing a few things. This placement on the outside of the hardware will not only help create a more uniform light profile, but also is going to allow us to place our handrail another 1/4 inch from the wall. Oh, and just to prevent our LED lead wires from hanging down there, I've added in these nifty little mounting brackets that IKEA includes with the lighting strips, just to help keep everything in place. So before we drill this thing into our studs, I just want to show you one more necessary feature that I added in here. So once I figured out inside which hardware placement I'd be hiding our cables, I then went ahead and notched a little space into the underside of the rail, just to make sure that the cables can't get pinched when we fasten on the hardware, while also making sure that we maintain access to these low-voltage wires at all times. I sort of just routed this out with a high-speed drill just before sticking the LEDs on there with their adhesive backing. You can see the notched space allows us to maintain quite a bit of slack, even when clamping down the hardware as hard as I can with my other hand. So you can see here in this other angle how the width of the handrail's plow gives us just enough space for 2 strips of LEDs alongside our hardware. And speaking of hardware, when it comes time to mount the rail, I'm loosely attaching both my top and bottom connections here, and getting every fastener attached to about 70%, before making sure everything is aligned and snugging it all up. I've also pre-drilled these holes both into each stud, as well as where the hardware connects into the rail. And do not over-tighten into your studs, as you can easily create some nasty drywall pops if you suck the sheetrock up against the stud too hard. And always use a stud finder capable of identifying wood versus plumbing or conduit, and when in doubt, consult a licensed professional. Okay, so you'll want to go ahead and get 4 of the 5 hardware placements on the wall, and then when it comes time for the hardware piece that's hiding our wires, we then want to offset our placement a bit, so that both the mounting screw and hole for our wires are going to go through just to the side of the stud. You can see how I've marked it a few inches off there. So then after drilling and vacuuming out our holes, we're ready to pop our wires through and go take a look from the unfinished side of the basement. And back here, I decided to just screw on this tiny piece of framing lumber. This way we'd still have something substantial into which we can screw our handrail hardware, while still maintaining access to our low voltage wires at all times. But before we plug these in and pair the sensors, there's one more bit of prep work we need to finish. You can see here that I use these low-profile LED mounting brackets every so often just to secure things in the event that IKEA's adhesive fails on the back of the strip lights. I also placed a few of them onto the base of the rail here, where we folded over our lead wires in order to secure that super low profile. There's also a handful of those IKEA-provided strip light mounts that you saw me slipping on there earlier. Oh, and I wouldn't recommend throwing a screw into that part where the wires are passing into the hardware, as we want to maintain that slack that I showed you earlier. You can see, though, that from this fairly unflattering side profile view here, things ended up looking pretty tidy. Okay, so with everything on the wall, all that's left to do is to pair up our sensors to our smart plugs and then place the sensors in a few inconspicuous spots that will allow for motion to be detected at both entry points. So you'll need to hold each sensor fairly close to its respective smart plug when it comes time to do the pairing. So I actually removed the bottom one and then paired them one at a time. So the way I ended up doing this is once you have the batteries in the sensor and the smart plug plugged in, you'll want to press and hold the system button on the sensor for 10 seconds until the light flashes red, and then starts and stops to signal it's been restarted and isn't stuck in a pairing mode from a previous attempt. From there, just hold it a few inches from the plug and quickly press the system button 4 times. And with both blinking like that, you then briefly hold the button on the smart plug to pair them together, receiving a confirmation in the form of a double blink. So rinse and repeat with the other set, and then we're on to the sensor placements. As I wanted both of these to point a bit downwards, I ended up placing these plastic shims wrapped in electrical tape behind the first sensor, and then just offset a piece of foam behind the other, fastening both into the wall with drywall screws. And if you don't have a structure to screw into, IKEA also includes some handy adhesive strips with these, so you also have that option. And one last thing, I did decide to cut down a bit of the filler piece that came with the rail, stain it, and glue it back into the last half inch or so of the plow, just to create a little more uniform light profile on the end, but honestly, it's sort of a matter of taste with something like that, so do whatever makes her happy. And there you have it. Custom handrail with dual motion sensor-driven LED lighting. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you've made it this far, please take a minute to hit that like button, or even consider subscribing as it really helps out the channel. All products featured in this build are linked in the description. Before tackling any home improvement project, be sure to verify local code requirements and permit regulations in your area. And I hope to see you next time. Thanks.